Okay, so we're back. Now we left off with abiotic and biotic factors. We're going to move on to exactly what is ecological succession. I already kind of described it to you a little bit as like disruptions that lead to changes in our environment. What ends up happening is that we want to turn back to some kind of equilibrium or what the biome can and should support. So we're going to be returning to whatever that is. If we lived in the desert and we had disrupted the environment, it would be cactuses, it would be little tiny shrubs, it would be the animals that live in the cactuses. All of that would kind of want to return to as it was. If we lived in a coastal environment, it would be the sandy beach grasses, it would be maybe some coconut trees, it would be all those things. If we lived in a grassland, a mature grassland ecosystem is primarily grasses. So that would be what we were trying to return to. In our heads, and when we see pictures of ecological succession, a lot of times the visual is the end result are big trees. But just keep in mind that that's not always the case. Sometimes it's the desert. Sometimes it's the coastal regions. Sometimes it is a temperate forest. So there are two types of ecological succession. It can be primary or secondary succession. Primary is starting at nothing. There is no dirt available, no soil available. Secondary succession means that you are starting with some soil at least. So we are going to start somewhere, and eventually we're going to build toward sort of like the apex or what our environment ultimately should be. So as you go from level to level, you're sort of replacing species that aren't quite as hardy or might be smaller or more tender or something to an environment that's much more stable. So the species of plants and animals that live at each of those levels is going to change a little bit. So there's going to be that gradual replacement of one community of living things to another through natural processes over time. All right. So again, primary succession begins in a place without any soil. Now, if you think about some examples of that, it would be sides of volcanoes, landslides, flooding that takes away soil. Flooding doesn't always have to take away soil, but it might. One major problem that people have when they're trying to determine if it's primary or secondary succession is how terrible does the event sound? So, does a tornado sound terrible? Yeah, a tornado can be devastating. But the question about whether it's primary or secondary succession starts with the soil. Would a tornado leave soil? Yes, a tornado would probably leave soil. It is the question of, are you starting with soil or not? So the severity of the event is related, but doesn't necessarily define whether or not it's primary succession or secondary succession. It's, are you starting with soil? If not, then it would be primary succession. If you're starting with soil, then it would be secondary succession. So in a primary succession event, the first organisms that live there are lichens. Now, lichens are organisms that are in symbiotic relationship with two organisms. So it's a fungi and sort of a protist, a plant-like protist. They're living together, they're feeding each other, they're helping each other, they live symbiotically. And I know that Mrs. Bonner spoke to you previously about symbiosis. The next organisms that live there are mosses. Now, mosses are very low growing plants without root systems. So they have to be very close to the ground and they have to be in a place where moisture or water are prevalent. Those are known as pioneer species. So just like pioneer in our regular language, it's an individual that goes out into sort of an under-investigated area and makes it their space. That's lichens and mosses. They go out there and they make it happen. So in order to move out of primary succession, lichens and mosses are going to have to start building soil. And that's what they do. Lichens and mosses, lichens do the work of kind of eating almost rock, breaking it down. When they die, they leave decaying biotic material. Mosses come in, kind of bury themselves in that, absorb the moisture, create more soil until eventually like small flowering weedy type of plants can come in. So lichens and mosses do the work of building that first sort of soil layer. we are going to talk about those pioneer species a little bit more on this next slide. We talked about how lichens break down rock to make soil and that they are low-growing mosses that kind of plant and trap that soil in place to prevent erosion to make way for other plants and animals to move in. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to look at the quiz. There's a little quiz there for you in terms of talking about lichens. Actually, no, we're going to keep moving. Got a few more slides before that. So soil starts to form as lichens, and the forces of weathering and erosion help to break down the rocks into smaller pieces. When the lichens die, they decompose, and that adds even more soil matter into that rock. And we already kind of discussed that. Here is a picture of that happening. So you can see kind of around the edges of this, there's some lichen, and then there's mosses closer toward the center. This would all be lichen around here. As the lichen dies and accumulates, we have a layer of soil that's being built. The mosses can live there in this region. And then finally, we have enough soil in this particular depression in the ground to support some plants. All right, so take a minute and I'm going to pause the video here and you will have an opportunity to take a little quiz there. Just a couple questions.